It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Oh, hi. Won't you be my neighbor? Well, here's the old frumpy professor in his Mr. Rogers sweater. So, sorry, we're not going to do kiddie stuff today. We're actually going to talk about really such an important piece of Paul's ministry. So if you need to go get your frumpy sweater, if it's cool where you are, or whatever, get settled, because we want to jump in and talk about Paul's missionary team, or as this shows, Paul's co-workers. And this is such an important piece of the strategy of Paul. The whole methodology is based on the fact that he wasn't working alone. He was actually working with quite a large team. So let's think about developing and deploying a mission team and seeing Paul as a model for that, because there's a lot in the book about how this team developed, how it grew, and how critical it was. So, Paul's mission team. Well, I don't know about you, but I've heard a lot of people talk about Paul, and I think for many years, sort of viewed Paul as a Lone Ranger. You know, Paul is courageous and he's called by God and he's out there doing this ministry sort of by himself, even though, you know, maybe a few people come in and out a little bit, but, you know, it's really about Paul and the fact that he was just a really hard worker. But what we see in the book of Acts, and actually we can see it very clearly in the epistles as well, is that his ministry expanded geographically essentially at the very same rate that his team was increased in size. Now, yes, Paul is moving from place to place, no question about that. But the team is expanding, and there's ongoing ministry in multiple places going on at the same time. So when we think about the expansion of the church and through Paul's ministry, the fact that there's quite a large growing team is absolutely critical to the whole approach. Now, traditionally, Paul's co-workers have been referred to as, I think this was really popular in the 1800s, an apostolic band. And I'm not really sure where that came from, except for the fact that there were a lot of ministry groupings in cities and out of churches and other places that were actually called bands. They, you know, you'd have an outreach band or an evangelism band, and they weren't necessarily you know, bands that were playing music. You know, this wasn't you know, just trumpets and drums or whatever. No, they actually just meant this was a team. What we would today most likely call a team. So today, I think more likely, instead of apostolic band, most people are going to probably talk about a missionary team. And again, Paul gives us a lot of information about his. So when did Paul become a team builder? Because it's not true that he started out this way as far as we can tell. In fact, there's no evidence that Paul built a team during the first 10 to 12 years of his ministry. Probably at least through his going back to Tarsus and the years that, and he was there a number of years. There's no mention of anyone working alongside of him. And some of this is not surprising because, especially early on, Christians were really nervous about Paul. Remember, he had been the chief persecutor, and, you know, and if they hadn't met him yet personally, I would think that a lot of them are like, you know, well, okay, but could I really trust that guy? And then he also, as we know, almost everywhere he went, because he was preaching publicly, caused a stir and quite often raised up the opposition. So it may not have been all that Paul wasn't interested in team. Maybe there were, sort of hesitancy for other people to join him. But the fact is, for quite some time in the early part of his ministry, let's say the first third of his ministry, if there were any teammates, we don't know who they were. And it seems quite possible that Paul learned this skill and the model of team building from Barnabas and the experience of going to Antioch. I mean, Barnabas went to Antioch, saw the great need, saw the opportunity with responsiveness, and realized, I need some help teaching and raising up this church to be what it could be. And so he went and found Paul and brought him back to Antioch with him. So in the storyline in Acts, beginning in Acts 11:25, from that point on, we don't really see Paul working by himself anymore, and quite often we're actually told who the team members were. So this is just an aside, but I find this interesting because I noticed years ago, mostly in mission circles, but I think it probably fits in even pastoral circles in America and other things, that there's a common progression of how a minister develops, and again, a missionary as a minister. The first one is learning how to minister myself. And as we're going to talk about in this class and in other classes, it often takes 5 to 7 years to maximize a particular person's potential in direct ministry. Now, they can actually keep growing and getting better and developing skills for 20 or 30 years. But to actually get to the point where, I'm gonna say world-class skill. In other words, professional kinds of skills. And I think that shouldn't be viewed as a bad thing. We should strive. I mean, we want our pastors to be true professionals who have really developed skills. And in missions, we want the same thing. And so, watching a lot of missionaries over the years, it's not that they can't do something really good and positive, even the very first month or two that they're there. But in terms of them reaching their personal, professional skill level, maximizing their potential, you're talking about at least 5 and 7 years is probably more likely. They are probably encouraging others during this time, and some people may learn some things from them, but their primary focus is, I need to learn how to do this well and be successful in accomplishing the task God's given me. Then what we often see then is that somewhere around 7 to 10 years, if they're doing their work well, other people start noticing, and now they become a model. Not that they're perfect, but they've already learned so many things, and the quickest way for somebody else to learn them is not to learn them by trial and error by themselves. So now they start showing others what it looks like. In our ministry, my first term, which was about 5 years, we were just struggling to figure out, how do you plant a church in a high-rise building in a very modern city in Singapore. And we made a lot of mistakes, but we were working hard, and we were slowly developing new skills. Then when we moved to Indonesia, by God's grace, we lived in the city where most of the new missionaries were coming. And even though I wasn't really thinking of it, a lot of them were learning from me by just listening to what I was doing in a village or whatever. I had a few things to teach them at that point. I'm still learning because we were in a new environment. But I know a lot more about things than most of them did in those early days. And so there was nothing formal at all. It was just, I'm a church planner reaching out to an unreached people group in the same city where there are lots of other brand new missionaries coming, And so they're going to look to me, which, oh my goodness, I had so far to go, but at least I was further along than they were. Then what we sometimes see in ministry, now a lot of people never move beyond the model thing, but when we start seeing people who really become influential, many times it's because they now begin to formally and intentionally mentor those who are not as far along as they are. And so they've learned to minister, and they've been a model probably for a while, and now they want to mentor. I was always a little bit hesitant and skeptical about somebody who wanted to start a new type of job, like jumping from pastoring to missions or something like that, a completely different kind of role, who immediately wanted, to have this influence over a whole bunch of people and be like a mentor. And I think, honestly, the best mentors are those who've taken a while to build this, a part of this progression that we're talking about here. And then I learned this from watching a number of colleagues who not only were mentoring, now they began to see that if you're going to have great fruitfulness in ministry, if you want reproduction, and not just what I'm reproducing, but the people I'm producing are reproducing, now I want to mentor people who are also going to become mentors or trainers. That was actually, some terminology that the IMB was using for a number of years, and I think it's a really smart thing to do. Again, I'm a little skeptical when somebody who's been in a country 6 months wants to be the multiplier. I think it probably takes a little bit of time, even if they get a lot of help. But again, this is a progression. And in some ways, I think we almost see something like this happening in Paul. He spends, let's say, up to 10 years just doing the ministry that God called him to. And then we pull him into the story in Acts, and he's sort of becoming a model for us because we see him preaching and those kinds of things. And then as this team around him began to expand, he's spending more and more of his energy mentoring others who are now going to go out and even go to places he might not get to. And now we're talking about multiplication, and that's that rapid expansion of the ministry that we see both in Acts and the epistles. So how did this team develop? Well, it's composed of Jews, which again we would think that most of the Jews think at that time they had a huge advantage, and they did because they knew the Old Testament. They had known about God all of their lives and now had come to faith in Christ, versus a typical Greek who came out of an idolatrous background and didn't know the concepts of the Old Testament until after becoming a Christian. But what we see, though, in Paul is that over time, the team becomes increasingly Greek. It is increasingly people from this pagan polytheistic background who have been transformed by Christ and the gospel. And quite honestly, it's not years and years and years and years later before they actually are contributing very significantly to this team, and I think that surprises those of us from the established church. We think someone coming out of something like this idolatrous polytheism, oh my goodness, we needed to disciple them and watch them for 5, 10, who knows how many years. No, Paul is quickly seeing that the resources for the further spread of the gospel are in the harvest in new places. And over time, he has fewer and fewer of those Jewish believers who are either from Jerusalem, especially those. In the early stages, Barnabas is one of those in the early stages. But after a while, Paul is working with teams that seem to be not 100% maybe, but very largely Greek background people who've come to faith and have been transformed. Now that opens up the possibility of really growing a team quickly, because that's a growing number of believers coming out of Paul's ministry. The team is composed of both men and women, and there's 17 women who are mentioned in Acts and the epistles as being important contributors to what Paul's doing in the ministry of the team. Now, I think there is one practicality that we can keep in mind here, though, is that there were women who were sort of on the outside edges of the team that Jesus had, and likely they didn't travel with the men. That just would have been culturally inappropriate, and maybe a moral problem, if they were traveling constantly with the men. And there's not really a lot of mention of the women traveling all the time, unless it's Priscilla with Aquila, her husband. So the women seem to be more likely people, and now there are other examples of women who went on mission trips and these other things, but the women seem to be a little more focused on local ministry on the team, but they are certainly there. And considering the cultural background of this time, for there to be 17 women mentioned in this ministry team in the first century is pretty amazing. That was not a norm that you would see in a lot of other fields. It appears, we're not always told somebody's spiritual gifting, but it appears that there is quite a variety of spiritual gifts. We know Barnabas he's a good evangelist and a teacher, a lot of other things, but primarily it seems encouragement, was his strongest gift. Silas, as I read the story, it seems to me that he may have had a gift of prophecy. And Timothy may have had, Paul certainly emphasized teaching with him, and also, tells him also, you need to do the work of an evangelist. But I think that just reminding him to work on this other thing, that wasn't his greatest strength, which is what he would be most naturally doing. So that's not a very broad, survey, but we know more about these people than a lot of the other parts of the team. So I just think we get this strong hint that not all of them, had the very same giftings, which is great because that's one of the strengths of team. You pulled together people in the team who are bringing different things to the ministry. Now, here's something that we see. Excuse me. These are all proven workers. Not again, in the context in which they were. They have proven to have Christian character. And we have examples of some who've been on a shorter mission trip, and now they joined the team with Paul for at least several years, if not maybe a decade or so. But let me just say again, the proven workers, those of us who've grown up in churches that are 100 years old or something like that, those churches are filled with people who've been believers 50 years or 20 years or 10 years. Well, none of Paul's co-workers had been a believer for 50 years. That wasn't possible. They just weren't believers that old yet. And coming out of the churches, which Paul's working with, mostly new churches, these are people who have proven themselves to love the Lord and want to serve Him. And people see that they have some gifting in that area. Not necessarily that, they've been at this for decades. That probably almost no examples of that on Paul's team because of the difference in the situation. Now, one interesting thing that I noted years and years ago, as a missionary and reading the New Testament, is that there's no general call for apostolic workers in Paul's letters. I mean, he does lay the groundwork saying that we should be going and we should be doing these things. But, he doesn't write the church in Colossae and say, hey, I need 10 more members of the team. Or, we just don't see that kind of thing. But from Acts, what we sense, and actually we get this in the epistles too, is that Paul was seeing possibilities in people and he was actually choosing them. Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't call people to missions today. I firmly believe that he does. But again, I would make a distinction between those who are called to be a witness wherever they are versus those who are called to go and join a missionary team long term.